Well, hello, Vaughn. We're talking on a Friday afternoon, shortly after the results of judicial recount in Surrey Guildford came out, and I guess that riding is going to stay with Gary Begg and the NDP. So
The
the
election
premier,
is over,
the
finally, I think.
election's over.
I think unless they find some more ballots over at Elections BC. As you know, they've had to disclose this week that, oh, a whole box of ballots turned up and a few other ballots turned up. And yeah, so it's a little concerning.
Right.
Let's say it was blamed on human error, Harold, and I guess we'll take that. But given the kind of charged atmosphere in which elections are conducted now, it's pretty important, I think, that there be a proper post-mortem on how they managed to miss a box of ballots and these other ballots turned up, and whether or not our procedures need to be tightened. So I think that's a legitimate concern going forward.
All right. And so Premier Eby can go ahead and govern, but as you've written and as he said, he's going to shun some conservative MLAs that he doesn't like. What does that mean? And is that
Well,
unusual for a premier to do?
it's extremely unusual. I mean, look, opposition members don't get as much attention from the government as government members. We sort of expect that. But in the legislature, all MLAs are equal and they have the same right to speak and they get to ask questions in question period. And even opposition members get to go to government ministries on behalf of their constituents and their communities to ask questions and seek redress and explanations. And they get to do that. And even opposition members get to do that. And the premier's comment that we won't work with certain conservative MLAs because of the comments they made earlier that the premier regards as hateful, and some of them are hateful and racist. He says, we're not going to work with them. We don't know if that means the government will obstruct them from doing their job in the legislature, if orders will go out to ministries that don't meet with these MLAs, don't, don't, it, you can condemn the member and the opposition members, but effectively, if you're going to ostracize them, you're also denying their constituents a voice. So the premier hasn't explained how far he will go, but just the thought that he might go that far is causing some concern. I don't think that's what should happen. And I think to punish the constituents for electing somebody you don't like is going too far.
Well, and even as you say, in a riding like Surrey South, where Brent Chapman won, a conservative who made some of these offensive
Yes.
comments over the years, you had 9,000 people who voted for the NDP. So they're also going to be ignored by the
Yeah.
premier.
Yeah. And I think it's a mistake to assume that the voters of Surrey South are bigots and racists and homophobes just because their MLA made some comments, some of them a long time ago, 10 years ago, right? I think people have their reasons for voting. They may have decided to overlook what Chapman said and voted because they weren't happy with the government on other issues. That happened all over the place, so it isn't surprising if it happened in Surrey South. There's a certain irony, this week that the premier immediately put out a statement congratulating Donald Trump on winning the election in the United States and saying, we'll work with you, Well, Donald Trump said far worse things about all kinds of people that most of us have never even thought of, and the far worse things than Brent Chapman ever said. So, but we can't ostracize the United States given its importance to the softwood lumber trade and the film industry and the Columbia River Treaty. We got to work with them. Well, South Surrey shouldn't be cut out of the picture either, in my view.
Well, that is interesting. You mentioned trade and trade anxieties with Trump's election and his vow to impose a 10% tariff across the board. How does the provincial government navigate this new government?
There's a certain irony in the 10% threat because as Derek Penner pointed out in a piece in the Sun this week, that would actually be a reduction in the tariff that the Biden administration was threatening the forest industry with, which was a 14.5% tariff. So Trump's threatened all kinds of things in the past, and Canada has managed to negotiate things with the Americans. And I think, our prime minister's already said, well, that's an opening position. Let's talk. We've had trouble with softwood lumber, as you know, Harold, going back decades. So I don't know as though it'll be worse under Trump than it was under the Democrats. It's already pretty bad. And the film industry thing is a big deal, although the main threat there is the state of California is talking about vastly increasing the incentives to produce films in California. And they're not just taking on British Columbia, they're taking on a bunch of American states, Ireland, Canada, Toronto. So we're in for a struggle there. The premier's already said that he doesn't know as though we can match the American incentives dollar for dollar. He's hoping that we have some other advantages that we can do. But yeah, our film industry is concerned for good reason.
On the other hand, do you see any advantages for BC with Trump? Any opportunities?
Not off the top of my head. I mean, I think we'll be in a competitive position where we have to consider some of our vehicle incentives and switch over to electric vehicles and all that, because it sounds like Trump is going to undo that. But if you go through the list of things that Donald Trump has threatened to do, it's such a long list that I don't know whether our anxieties are any different or even as great as they are in some places. So I think we'll just see. There's concern about the border. If he actually is serious about deporting people, will they come to Canada? We've had some problem with that in the past, but much of that's ended up in the eastern provinces. So again, we'll see. But yeah, I mean, I think everyone's anxious about what it all means, and
yeah,
we're gonna need to work together and pull together as a country to deal with a lot of it.
Well, back here in BC, where it took a lot longer to decide the election than it did the U.S. election, when are we going to get a cabinet in Victoria?
Well, the premier has announced that he's going to appoint a cabinet on November the 18th, which is perhaps by coincidence the second anniversary of David Eby taking the oath of office as premier, but it's a full month after the election. Now, there have been some delays in counting, although we got the final count before the end of October, so it was clear for him to appoint a cabinet after that. He couldn't appoint the member from Surrey Guildford because that result was still subject to recount, but he could have appointed the rest of his cabinet. The Democrats are playing this up as transition. It's not really transition. It is transition from the David Eby government to the David Eby government. He was premier on election day. He's premier now, and he'll be premier when he appoints a cabinet. An example I pointed out was, we refer to the mother of parliaments in the UK, and we have a similar system. Well, the election in the UK was July the 4th. They changed parties in government. The new prime minister, Keir Starmer, was appointed the next day as prime minister. He appointed his cabinet 2 days later. He called their parliament back within 2 weeks. So do we really need to delay for a full month here? I mean, the premier promised to hit the ground running. Strikes me as it's more like a leisurely stroll toward appointing the cabinet. And I don't know why it's taken them so long, unless they're really struggling to figure out what the election actually means for them and how to proceed.
Do you think it will be the same size cabinet? Do you have any indications of whether it'll be smaller or there might be some new or redefined ministries?
Well, that's a good question. So he's got 12 vacancies in the cabinet and 15 holdovers. So it's a big cabinet, but he had a big caucus. And you put ministers in to keep people busy and give them things to do, right? I think a smaller cabinet would make sense. They've got a smaller caucus. And the other thing about starting off with a smaller cabinet is if you get in trouble down the road, you can expand it and add people. So I think a smaller cabinet would be in order. We've not heard very much about changes. There's an expectation that Mike Farnworth, who's the most experienced member in the House, would be back as government House leader because he understands the procedures, knows how to take advantage of them. That would make sense. Probably still remain as public safety minister. There's been an expectation, a lot of rumors that Adrian Dix will be moved as health minister. He's been health minister for 7 years. I think there's a feeling that he's done and said pretty much everything he could say and do in that ministry. And there's still, big concern about ERs closing all over the place. So I think that would make sense. We need a new finance minister, need a new forest minister. Big hole in the government on Indigenous relations because the Indigenous relations minister retired and the minister in charge of land and resources was defeated. Well, a big part now of Indigenous relations in BC is managing Crown land and resources with First Nations. So there's a pretty big jobs to fill there and a lot of new members who don't have a lot of experience. So on paper, I don't think Eby has as strong a cabinet as he inherited from John Horgan.
Well, I can't let you go this week, Vaughn, without your thoughts on the passing of Fay Young.
Fay Young, 92 years old, a good long life. She's one of those incredible characters that come forward in British Columbia that you couldn't make up and you don't need to make up. Very colorful, lively. Nobody who ever heard Fay Young's voice would ever forget it, that rapid fire staccato voice, the flamboyant outfits, particularly the hats, right? And, she was a major pillar in the Chinese Canadian community, charity work. She was everywhere. She was also a woman with a mission. She helped bring down another unforgettable character, Bill Vander Zalm. A lot of detail goes into the story, but basically, Fay Young blew the whistle on Vander Zalm's dealings, selling his property, Fantasy Garden World, to a Taiwanese billionaire. Fay was the broker on the deal, the go-between, and she later got mad at Vander Zalm because she claimed he hadn't shared the commission with her. We don't know how that ever played out. Vander Zalm never acknowledged that he owed her money, but she brought out enough information about that transaction that Vander Zalm called on Ted Hughes, former Attorney General, to investigate. And Hughes came back and concluded that Vander Zalm had violated his own conflict of interest guidelines. And Vander Zalm resigned as premier. So, that's a major role she had in her life. That all happened 30 years ago. And you'd run into Fay Young all the time because she was a public figure and she was always around. And the Vancouver Sun had a cruise to Alaska on our 100th anniversary. And Fay bought a ticket. She was on the cruise and everybody was lining up to meet her and get her autograph because she was famous. And she would always seek out reporters and talk to us about, what we'd done and seen. Last time I saw Fay Young was before that was a roast for Gordon Campbell. She was in the audience. And as I said, she always came up and introduced herself to the reporters who had covered her. And she comes up to me and she says, Vaughn Palmer, it is so good to see you again. I must tell my husband, Dean, he likes your column in the paper. And Socrates standing next to us goes, Fay, didn't Dean pass away a few years ago? Oh, yes, she says. Yes, he is in heaven. I talk to him every day. I kind of hope they had a reunion this past week. Yeah, unforgettable character.
Well, thanks, Vaughn. Thanks again. Unforgettable story. Thank you. And we'll chat again next week.
Okay, great, Harold. Talk again. Thanks.